I'm Rick Dudarian, and you're listening to Realms of Memory. The destruction and human devastation caused by the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s were like nothing experienced in Europe since World War II. Over 20 years on, the repercussions of the breakup of Yugoslavia continue to reverberate. Orly Friedman, a professor in the Faculty of Media and Communications at Singa Dunam University in Belgrade, has spent the past 2 decades studying how memory activists in Serbia and the region confront the memory of this past. What are the goals of these memory activists, and what challenges do they face? What strategies have they used, and how successful have they been? How has memory activism changed across generations and worked across borders? To answer these questions and more, I'm very pleased to welcome Orly Friedman. Orly, thanks for taking time to join this episode of Realms of Memory.
Hi, Rick. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start just with a question about your own background. That's where you start in your book, and you talk about how your interest in the region really was, the region of Yugoslavia, and Serbia in particular, was shaped by your own experience growing up in Israel. So how do the memoryscapes of your own country shape your interest in this region?
Yes, I think this is a thought that has been kind of with me for a long time since I would say I entered my own education in my undergrad and graduate work, well into afterwards doing research. I keep thinking comparatively of conflict more broadly, and of course of memory politics, and I became interested in thinking about our own memoryscapes and the places where we come from and grow up, or our mnemonic socializations, if you want, and how those shape the questions we ask, the research we do, the topics we work on. And I think as I begin actually in my book, for me, growing up in Israel in a very sort of being a product of a system, a very indoctrinated system, never meeting Palestinians until I started my undergraduate studies, but also never being exposed to their own narratives, let alone memories and histories, right? And in that sense, thinking of memoryscapes that clash through days on the calendar was an early experience for me, when I came to understand that the day when we were celebrating the Independence Day of the State of Israel actually marked for Palestinians the Nakba Day, the day of their disaster and the expulsion of approximately 750,000 Palestinians for what became the State of Israel. And so coming to know about it and actually needing to sort of engage with alternative knowledge and what will become, in my understanding, also counter memories, was a very challenging process, intellectually, emotionally, in terms of my citizenship, my political upbringing and identity. And this happened all through my years at the university, first in Hebrew University and then in Tel Aviv University. And I think one more thing probably in that trajectory is, I remember the first time I did participate in a protest on Israel's Independence Day. And that was the first time I sort of didn't celebrate the day itself, but I understood sort of the injustice that has been ongoing for many years. And this takes us back to the late 90s, right before the collapse of the Oslo agreements. And so I would say this is briefly coming to know in a society that didn't want to engage with what I later understood as unwanted memories on one hand, and also this upbringing in spaces of denial, very deep layers of silence and political denial that sort of made me very interested to look into these processes, first comparatively, but also kind of zooming in to eventually the case of Serbia, but also looking at other places in the world that are dealing with the deep processes of denial, and also searching for those who are trying to engage with the anti-denial work, what I call in the book, and engage with memory activism, and if you want, kind of actions from below that break silences in the society.
So for listeners who aren't familiar with the human impact of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, how seismic was this past? I mean, what kind of impact did it have? How many, in what ways, and on what scale did it affect the people in the region?
Yeah, I would say the impact of the violent breakup of Yugoslavia is still something that you can really feel even today, even when we speak about decades after these wars. Some of the processes are still ongoing. You can even look at today's mass protests, recent mass protests in Serbia against violence, and trace some of the dynamics that have emerged here in this period back to the legacies of the 90s and of the wars, right? And in Serbia, the legacies of the 90s are not only the wars, and I speak about it, I kind of tell the story of the 90s in the book in a sense of, yes, a number of wars, from the war in Croatia to the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina to the war in Kosovo, over a decade of warmongering and war politics, yet also internally tremendous challenges, from mass anti-regime protests to mass migration to a collapse of the monetary system and everyday life and sociability in the country. In the region itself, the impact of the war, to kind of address your question more specifically, means that nowadays we have completely new borders that have also generated and created new identities. There's much less mobility of people in the region than there was during the existence of Yugoslavia itself. There's the human losses. We know we can say, and the number of the victims were established. We are talking about approximately 140,000 people, 100,000 alone in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So this was sort of the most bloody war from all the wars. We are we can trace the impact of mass displacement of then refugees, but also internally displaced people, about 4 million people who were displaced, and half of them were from Bosnia-Herzegovina itself. These are today small countries, so you can imagine the impact of this. The question of missing people is still in the region unresolved. The highest number of missing people probably today is still in Kosovo. Profound demographic change from multi-ethnic spaces and cities to homogeneity of those ethnic homogeneity of those spaces. If you want, some scholars have addressed this sort of process of tribalism, major economic devastation, economic decline that in some of the spaces didn't really bounce back. And for me, dealing with the question of the human being who deal with the past here, of course, the biggest challenge is throughout the region, nationalist and exclusionary discourses governed by politics of denial. When we speak about denial, more specifically, denial of war crimes, of course, denial of political responsibility, and governed also by politics of victimization and historical revisionism. So the last point that I've just introduced probably is where the memory activists have the hardest task to even engage with these issues critically.
So you mentioned, though, that there was a moment in time in the early 2000s where there was a lot of optimism that there could be some kind of effort to confront the past, some kind of national catharsis, that there were significant political changes, a mobilization of the people. What was that period of optimism, and why did it not pan out?
Yes, so to try and explain that, we have to go probably to say the period that built up to October 2000, October 5th, 2000, the ousting of Milosevic and his regime. And I think from the many conversations that I had with people who were there in the streets in the months building to this event, eventually on October 5th, the hopes were high. The hopes for change were high after, say, a decade that many people have referred to as sort of abnormality, right? And yet, after Milosevic was brought down and eventually also was sent to The Hague, then some people would say, okay, the person itself, he was gone, but the system that he created was very much still in place. And we, those who follow the events in Serbia today can even see some of it in a clear way. And so the hopes were, I would say initially, not just the question of dealing with the past, but as I mentioned, some of the dynamics of Serbia in the 90s were hopes. The hopes were to sort of re-enter the family of the nations, be accepted back on one hand, but also go back to living in a functioning society, in a functioning state, and enter the process of democratization in Serbia. And this process, the hope was that will also entail the questions of for some, it was the hope that this will also include dealing with the crimes committed in the 90s and moving forward with the acknowledgement of those and the political responsibility. And in that sense, some people have argued, October 5th happened, but October 6th never came. The first years after October 5th, there were some actors from, of course, led by Zoran Đinđić and others from the opposition, and some of the major actors, say, from the opposition and even in anti-war circles were then in positions of top advisors to the new regime and even entering parliament and government. But after the assassination of Zoran Đinđić in March 2003, it became clear then that the country is going in a complete different direction than what they were hoping. Having said that, for some politically, this made sense. They weren't hoping for that change that say the more liberal and for sure anti-war circles were aiming to. And I think in that sense, in the book, I also speak a little bit and in previous research about the difference between tracing the anti-war actions and anti-war, say, demonstrations during the 90s and the anti-regime demonstrations. And they weren't always overlapping with their political aspirations and hopes.
But I mean, is it fair to say that if maybe there was a moment of time, there was an opportunity, but that didn't happen in part because there was a lot of institutional continuity? That really reminds me of my episodes on what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union and why did they not confront the past more aggressively. And there were a lot of institutions that just carry over and a lot of pride about their roots in the Soviet past. And they really didn't clean the house out when they had the chance. in part, who knows? Maybe there's a concern about the instability that could result from that. But there's a lot of it. To me, it seems like there's a tremendous amount of continuity just in terms of the leadership. That how do you aggressively confront the past if your leadership is still implicated in that past?
Right, and there was no illustration process in this country, and the attempt to undo the say criminalization of the system in some ways by Zoranjic, it had was brought to an end, right? In some ways, among other things that he was trying to do. So yes, in that sense, the structures have remained and were not transformed.
I think that's one of Jenny Wustenberg's points, is that you've got to wait for a generation of people to leave the scene, and then there's a greater possibility of change, that you've got kind of built-in resistance with the people who are part of the old order.
I just, one of my first I think my very first interview here in 2004, when I was here for a year doing my research for my dissertation, was with the late Srbljanka Turajlic. Srbljanka Turajlic was a university professor who was a very important figure in supporting the students' demonstrations and protests in the 1990s and in the political life of the what they call at the time Druga Serbia, the other Serbia. She passed away recently, yet at the time, and after 2000, she was an important figure also in advising the new regime. But at the time, she told me, and it echoes with what you just said. She said, "I truly believe no person from my generation," she referred to her own generation, who lived through the 90s as adults and have witnessed what happened in their society. No one from my generation should hold an official position and role in this society moving forward. And of course, that was her wish, right? It resembles then the wish to sort of reset and restart and see a new generation come in and to take over those who were not part of leading this country in the 90s. And yet, of course, it didn't happen.
A big theme in your book is the importance of calendars, and in many ways, nations borrow from organized religion, setting up their own sacred calendars to anchor people in a shared community of meaning. So you have the breakup of Yugoslavia, and now you have these 7 separate countries that come out of that one nation, and they all have to construct their new national calendars. And denialism, you point out, is a common theme. So how does that work in terms of the new calendar in Serbia? How is it constructed to reinforce denialism? What are the new holidays and rituals that are supposed to anchor people in a new Serbian identity that they can be proud of?
Right. So it's not only about denialism, right? From the point of view of the state of Serbia, it has different dynamics, one of which we're now talking about sort of the post-Yugoslav calendar, the sort of leaving behind and breaking with the Yugoslav past and the socialist past. So in many ways, as we know, it's going back to the pre-Yugoslav time to sort of restructure the social organization of the calendar and anchor it in the 19th century and to center sort of events and symbols, but also some values from the 19th century in terms of creating new identity, new discourses, and a value system. And for me, the idea of calendars is very interesting, and it builds on works of scholars like Evyatar Zubovel and Yael Zrubavel, very early scholars of our field of memory studies before we even called it the field of memory studies, who thought about the social organization of our memory, and say if we think about the calendar as a site of memory. And the idea that the calendar can be edited and re-edited, right? So if the master commemorative narrative of Yugoslavia had the Yugoslav calendar with its most important holidays that sort of celebrated Tito's birthday, or celebrated the establishment of Yugoslavia on the 29th of November, and had its own rituals and commemorative events around that. In the aftermath of Yugoslavia, yes, as you mentioned in your question, each of the successor states will now sort of recreate its own calendar. And in Serbia, it's a process that is very much ongoing. Actually, as I was writing the book, there was a new holiday that appeared on the calendar and was introduced to the people, and I sort of had a chance to last minute add some additions to my to the chapter about the Serbian calendar. I think also I was able throughout my different stages of research to really trace this creation of the new calendar. As I show, from a day like Dan Državnosti, the Day of the State, that was first introduced, but no one actually knew about it. And so how do you establish a date, but also then create some rituals around the date that first people know about it and know about the meaning and what do they do on that day, and how they actually engage with celebration. So this sort of more broadly about the Serbian calendar, particularly in my interest, because my interest is in the memories of the 90s, or the unwanted memories of the 90s, I was interested to see what on the Serbian calendars does allow engagement to the public with the legacies of the 90s, right? And if you want, I can get into it a little bit more in explaining.
Yeah, because if you're going to put dates on that calendar, people have to be able to relate to them for those dates to resonate. So you've got to include things that people can identify with. It might be more challenging if you're trying to refer back to something that happened in the 19th century or earlier.
Right, so it's a process of creating new identities, right? And that's why it was so fascinating, again, coming from a very indoctrinated society around a very specific calendar that we all grew up on and sort of followed very seriously through the education system, through the youth movement, through the state-sponsored event. I began also to understand the calendar. Yes, on one hand, it is the state-sponsored calendar, which now sort of allows people to, as you say, identify or regroup around certain ideas and narratives and stories that we tell ourselves. Yet at the same time, in very divided societies, what we see is that we can identify also alternative calendars. Right, so not only the one that is sort of the hegemonic one, the one that is acknowledged and run by the state and its administration of the past and the memory, but what if I will look into alternative calendars and how sort of actors from below can engage with now creating new rituals of commemorations that in a way clash with the state memory politics, hence the state calendar, right? And this is sort of a very interesting process as well to follow. And now, of course, in order to identify the alternative calendar and analyze those, we have to put them side by side with the state-sponsored calendars.
So you mentioned that there are events. It's not complete amnesia about the 1990s. I mean, there are events that are incorporated in significant rituals that have been gaining momentum, that are on the calendar. So how is the 1990s and the wars in the region, how are they included into the official calendar?
So the official calendar sort of have chose to mark events that have to do only with Serbian victimhood, right? So we have two main events that appear on today's calendar of Serbia. The beginning of the NATO bombing on March 24th, and which sort of also kind of was a process of cementing discourses of NATO aggression against Serbia, and very much of political of the victimization, and very much also detached completely from what happened during the 90s and before, during the bombing and before in Kosovo itself. And this event was not placed on the calendar, say, right away in the year 2000 or 2001. In fact, Zoran Đinđić himself, in the years that he was in power, was very much against placing this event as a central event on the commemorative landscape, let's say, in Serbia. So I think it's fair to say from 2015, 2016 and on, it becomes a much more sort of central event, which is then there's a commemoration which is broadcasted live on TV, etc. The other event is Operation Storm, sort of marking Uluya, Operation Storm, that culminates in early August 1995, which actually commemorates the expulsion of Serbs from Croatia, the ethnic cleansing, if you want, of Croatia from Serb population, and sort of the images of the columns of refugees sort of being on their way to the border with Serbia. And again, as I started in the beginning of our conversation, there's events. These are events that mirror each other if we bring together conflict and memory studies, right? So August 5th is celebrated in Croatia as the Day of the Victory and Homeland Thanksgiving Day and the Day of the Croatian Defenders, while in Serbia it's being a sort of day of mourning, again, very much in a centralized way from 2015 and on. And also with the NATO bombing, it's interesting to see the mirroring of it when in Kosovo they mark the end of sort of the entrance of the NATO ground forces to Kosovo after the end of the bombing on June 10th and the entrance on June 12th of the NATO forces. So it sort of mirror each other, and politically speaking and mnemonically speaking, there's very little conversation between these dates and the way they're being commemorated. And that's, I think, part of what the memory activists themselves are attempting to do worldwide, and particularly in this case, as I explained, in Serbia and in the region.
But I mean, is your sense that the way in which the state is commemorating the 1990s, does it work? I mean, do people buy into it? Does it resonate with people?
Well, again, I think Serbia is a very divided society, right? And so it resonates with people who sort of adhere more to the nationalist and exclusionary discourses in Serbia. And of course, as time goes by, there's also new generations who are being taught these narratives in school. That's the only thing they know. And they don't know to put the NATO bombing in the broader context of even what led to it, right? And so it resonates with the people who also adhere with the present regime, but also with nationalism in this country, and it's extremely uncomfortable and something you have to combat if you are in a position of wanting a Serbia that will head in a very different direction than it was heading so far.
The beginnings of your work on memory activism really go to the women in black, right? And your own work is really on peace activism, and that's where they start. So, what is this group? How do they evolve over time from being peace activists to memory activists? And what kind of tactics do they use?
Right. So my book actually puts forward the main frame methodologically that I used was through the generational belongings of memory activists, right? And I try to trace the continuation and change from one generation to another, and that also sort of goes back to my earlier work on anti-war activism and peace activism, and the Women in Black were one of the first groups I actually joined when I began my research here and traced their activism, say, in the aftermath of the wars, and very much also trying to learn at the time of what they did during the wars. And the Women in Black, and I heard about the Women in Black because they model after the Israeli Women in Black, who were standing for many years, unfortunately not so much anymore, on Fridays, a weekly silent vigil against the Israeli occupation of Palestine and of Palestinians' lives, right? And so the Women in Black were created here in Serbia at the very early stages of the war in Croatia as a feminist and anti-militarist and anti-nationalist group, and of course for peace against the war. And they took the practice of the Israeli Women in Black, yet I would argue implemented in a much more strict way, because the initial idea was that they were doing a weekly silent vigils in downtown Belgrade, especially during the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Later on, during the war in Kosovo, they couldn't really do it, especially once the NATO bombing began. It was unsafe for them to even stay here. And so I tried to understand their actions at the time. And of course, they were in a broader networks of other groups that have become a sort of non-governmental organizations and civil society groups who were resisting the war. But while some of these groups were, say, withdrawing to the offices, writing reports, there were also groups that were documenting war crimes as they were happening. The Women in Black kept their sort of idea of street action, right? That the action has to happen in the street. It has to interact with the citizen, the fellow citizens in the street, and send a message against the war. And as I said, they took a much stricter understanding of the silent vigils, because they were really sort of, while the Israeli Women in Black began answering back when people were cursing them or sort of shaming them in the street, here in Serbia, the principle was that you never answer back when you're standing in the street with a sign against the war, dressed in black, and people insult you or even try to hurt you, you never answer back.
Which they do, right? They do get insulted, and there are efforts to lash out at them.
Very much so. And so in the first year when I joined them, I realized they actually established they're no longer sort of in anti-war activism. What they're doing, it became clear to me as I was doing the research, and even later on, they're engaging profoundly with sort of the past and the recent past and the 90s, right? And that's what I covered in my research. By the way, they also engage with with other memories as to do with memories of Yugoslavia. They engage also with the rehabilitation of figures like Draž Mihailovic or others from World War II, right? So they engage also with issues with the memories of World War II and Yugoslavia. I focus mostly on their engagement with an insistence on remembering the crimes committed in the 90s in their name, right? And that's hence their slogan, "Not in my name." And they sort of position themselves as this generation that lived through this event, has living memories of these events. They were already adults during the 90s, very much also Yugoslavs in their identity, and of course feminist in their actions and in their claims. And that's how I sort of trace this shift from the anti-war activism to memory activism. And I also show how actually they have created through their activism in the aftermath of the wars an alternative calendar. And this calendar is a printed calendar. They actually print and share their own calendar as a group with their members and sympathizers and supporters from other civil society groups. But they also have a certain calendar which they still follow in street actions throughout the years to mark events, let's say, such as the beginning of the siege on Sarajevo, to the siege on Vukovar, to what I claim is the most important event on their alternative calendar, the commemoration of Srebrenica as a genocide in downtown Belgrade.
And the way they commemorate that especially that most important event, it's not static, right? It changes over time.
Right. I was able to trace this commemoration truly over a longer period of time. First, when I was doing research on that, but then when I returned and continued to live here every year, I would attend with them as many others, as some other people from the city, the July 10th. The event, and they chose to commemorate Srebrenica on July the 10th in Republic Square, because on July 11th, which is the official day of commemoration, they travel to Potocari next to Srebrenica, to the site of memory, and to partake in the official commemorations there, where they also meet with the mothers of Srebrenica. And they do a street action, yes, which looks very creative, and also engages groups like the Dach Theater from Belgrade, and so they're doing street performance. And every year it looks a little bit different than the year before, with some themes that always continue. For example, it's important for them to say it out loud and through their banners that they acknowledge Srebrenica as a genocide, while the country itself, an official state-sponsored memory in Serbia, does not.
And then you mentioned too, reading the names of the victims out loud is something that's a part of the evolution of how they commemorate that.
This was 1 year. So 1 year they were reading the names of the victims who were identified and buried that year, right? Because not all the victims of Srebrenica were yet found and identified, and it's an ongoing process. And every year there is a whole, the part of what builds up to the commemoration in Potocari on July 11th is the sort of delivery of the remains of those found during that year to be buried in the graveyard in Potocari. And in that sense, it is still an ongoing process, right? It's not over yet. So what I saw was that in 1 year they gathered and stood for the silent vigil, but also that year read all the names of the victims who were about to be buried the next day in Potocari. Other years, they sort of stand with the letters of Srebrenica, putting forward also the number of the victims, 8,372, and sort of standing with that, but also with some performance and action around that. In another year, they called citizens to bring shoes. They collected shoes in an idea that they will create sort of a monument to Srebrenica in Belgrade. And in other years, they bring flowers and eventually walk to the bridge above the river and sort of let go of the flowers there. So really every year there's different performance that they choose to do.
So it really reminds me of my episode on forensic memory in Spain, and part of the effort to break the silence is to reclaim the recognition for people who were disappeared in the public space.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think here there's also, it's to acknowledge that. It's also to offer their acknowledgement. It's also to remember and to remind. So it's not only that they're remembering, they're also insisting on reminding the passerby. And mind you, it happens every year in July, the summer. The city is packed, everyone is out. In recent years, there's more also tourists in Belgrade, maybe something that we didn't see here 20 years ago. Now it looks like much more like a city that receives the summer, and they're standing in the very heart of the city and insisting in many ways on that memory, which is one of the unwanted events and memories that happened in the 90s.
So what's the significance of doing this in Republic Square?
It's the very center of the city. Right, and as I said, they always kept this idea of the street action, and for them, the street action meaning you're in direct contact with fellow citizens, with passersby, and yes, there will be those who will be there for the counter, protest against them, but there will be those who will pass by and see that and may kind of interact with that as part of sort of alternative knowledge even that they're bringing into the city center, again, in a way that in a city that doesn't have any street names or names of squares or anything that marks some of those events that happened in the 90s. So the significance of that is sort of to bring back the claim of taking political responsibility on these events by remembering them, right, in the very city center, if you want. And this is, again, a practice that they also stood in the city center in the 90s and in the anti-war silent vigil during, as I mentioned, the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
So you have a younger generation of activists that you point out. They continue to commemorate some of the same events. They continue to hold similar protest vigils, but then they innovate in significant ways, and then they emphasize other histories that are maybe closer to their generation in time. How does the memory work evolve with a younger generation of activists?
Right. So this is what I call the second generation of memory activists. The first is the Women in Black and other groups as well as that was sort of belongs to that generation, if you want, from the Helsinki Committee for Human Rights or from the Humanitarian Law Center and other actors. And that's the first generation. The second generation, I mostly trace the group called the Youth Initiative for Human Rights. But again, other members of other groups or also citizens of the city who belong to that generation and join their actions, even if they're not specifically members of this group. And what I wanted to see was exactly if I can trace some, on one hand, continuation, and on other hand, a change, both in the claims that they're making and putting forward, but also in their practices, mnemonic practices. And so one thing I highlight, for example, is the change of the slogan. If the Women in Black have a number of slogans, the one I sort of put forward was the "Not in My Name" as their generational belonging. The Youth Initiative back somewhere in 2015, I noticed that they came up with a new slogan where they claim that they're too young to remember, yet determined never to forget. And so this is sort of, again, their generational claim, and taking that sort of stand towards the past. And then I saw, I was analyzing the way they continue some of the events that the Women in Black were marking on their calendar. They continue also to mark those, yet sometimes trying, so they either join the existing alternative commemoration, or they try to also kind of come up with their own. So one of the examples of their own is to take the event of Srebrenica, yet to insist on remember those in Belgrade on July 11 itself. So instead of traveling with the Women in Black that they used to do at the beginning to Potocari, to stay in Belgrade and to continue and engage in the public and in public spaces with this otherwise very silenced memory. The other event that I analyzed, that the second generation engages with, I think, in a very interesting way, has to do with the crimes committed during the war in Kosovo, and more broadly with the war in Kosovo, right? And this is sort of the burden of a very silenced and buried past. There's very little discussions and conversations about the war in Kosovo, as I said, beyond, say, the NATO bombing and the crimes committed against Serbs in Kosovo. And so I was able to trace some of their claims and actions as, for example, relate to the existence of mass graves that were found in Serbia, and even in the outskirts of Belgrade, in Batajnica, where remains of Albanian victims were buried and found later in mass graves in Serbia. And again, when these events happen, there's very little discussion about them, and that's part of what they're trying to do. So on one hand, it's introducing new commemorative events and practices. Also online, we can get to speak about the use of the digital memory practices, but also through artwork and through other practices such as memory walks, and also what I was able to notice, engaging with memory of activism. And this is back to the memory activism nexus, the memory of activism, again, in societies in the whole region that glorify war criminals. Memory of activism, what I understood was that they have to now, if they want to resist this glorification of war criminals, they have to find their own heroes, right? And so going back to trace and unfold the actions of the first generation of memory activists who were anti-war activists during the 90s, it means to sort of engage with remembering the legacies of the anti-war activism that took place in not only Belgrade, but more broadly in Serbia, to educate themselves about it and to engage with what was done and how was done, as well to learn from the mistakes of the past, but also to sort of engage with that as memory of activism.
So I was gonna ask you, well, how can you discover a mass grave in the heart of the capital and not have that generate a discussion?
So it wasn't discovered in the heart of the capital. One of the mass graves that were discovered in 2001 was in Batajnica, which is actually you in the US you would call it in the suburbs of the city. So it's about 20 kilometers out of the city center, right? And this was discovered in 2001, sparked at the time some discussions, and very fast went into oblivion. And these are the practices of silencing the past, of course.
But isn't there media coverage, or is that reined in, or how does that work?
There was media coverage of at the time, both internationally and locally, and even later there were more mass graves that were discovered in other parts, in South Serbia mostly. And it sort of comes to the surface and very fast goes away and being silenced. As I try to argue, that's based on what activists themselves tell me, these are unwanted pasts, right? So the activists themselves I borrow this idea from the activists themselves when they show how in their own actions it's so difficult to engage with some of these issues from the past, as there's no will and framework in the society to engage with that. Part of it has to do with fatigue. Part of it has to do with layers of apathy of people who needed to protect themselves maybe from knowing. And part of it has to do with the memory politics, as has been created and administrated in the last decade, say since the year 2000, right? And so, in a way, when the activists, one of the things I discuss in the book is what the memory walks, and I joined one of the memory walks of the Center for Public History when they invite young people or educators or students to join them in memory walks. So they do memory walks in Belgrade, for example, to remember the anti-war activism, and they also did memory walks to this direction of the site where the mass graves were found in Batajnica. There's no access to this place because it's in a place of a police base inside, but they're inviting people to sort of take this walk to imagine the distance from the city center and to tell them about the narrative of what actually happened and what led to these crimes in the war in Kosovo. And they attempted also to do an action to erect a plaque or a monument outside of this place, which now, as I discuss in the book, only exists as a sort of digital monument online in the website and online platform that they have created it's called the Batajnica Memorial Initiative.
Okay, so you have a whole chapter on digital activism, and does this pertain more towards more to the younger generation? This is another dimension, another resource available to them.
Yes. So actually, we can speak, of course, about the digital turn in the social sciences, and then there's the works on the digital turn in memory studies. The digital turn for me happened as I was doing one of the sort of periods of my research, and I just I started stumbling upon engagement with actions and engagement online on social media with these alternative calendars that I've mentioned. and also with the narratives and with engaging with online platforms as another place to sort of claim and engage with the production of alternative knowledge. And so I started following that and actually came to think about the framework that I put forward in the book of hashtag memory activism, right? And I try to argue that this framework can allow us to trace the growing prevalence of digital memory activism, but also of online commemorations and commemorative events on social media, right? And so the hashtag memory activism I approach as the online commemoration of contested pasts on social media, as activists are utilizing hashtag as a mnemonic practice. And then I also came to think about it as a mnemonic tactics, right? And what I do is I took a number of hashtags and I analyze each of them as a case study. And that allows me, as the framework, to trace the genealogies of the hashtag. Sometimes it's one person who came with the idea and took it into an organization that allowed it to be used and mobilized more broadly. Sometimes it's the organization itself that came up with hashtags. Sometimes they happen ad hoc because of the banning of some event. But it allows us also kind of to delve deeper into the engagement of activists with memory politics in their societies and with other venues to do action, especially when a certain event or commemorative event is being banned from the street of their cities.
Yeah, so you offer some examples of where you have certain events that are banned, and it's through hashtag activism that you're able to mobilize people and make commemorations possible.
Yeah, and in that sense, the aim of the activists is never just to stay online, right? It circulates back, and their aim is for that to circulate back to the street. And so the first hashtag that I began to trace and study was the Dan Bielih Traka, the White Armband Day, and that was just briefly an event that was it was an attempt of activists in Bosnia-Herzegovina, actually, in the town of Prijedor, to commemorate the 20th anniversary to the crimes committed against non-Serb communities in Prijedor, that is today in Republika Srpska in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And they were banned from getting together in the street, and actually their claim was also to erect a monument in memory of the kids that were killed in Prijedor. And so what they did was, from a one-man standing in the street where he's kind of, in spite of the ban, he was Emir Hodzic, who was standing on his own in the main square in Prijedor. They took this image and this goes viral online. And they managed to, I actually traced, this is another text before the book with my colleague Katerina Ristic, where we traced how this event became transnational, even in the participation of people from all around the world, but also from the region, in commemorating the White Armband Day, which and there's like a whole engagement with that online, when people put the white band on their arm, as to resemble the call for people for non-Serbs to mark their houses, to diasporic communities, but also other members of other communities who participated for a few years, I would say, with this online action on May 31st. And May 31st eventually becomes one of those days that, at least in Serbia, is an alternative day on an alternative calendar. And fast forward a few years after that, sort of very strong anti-denial campaign, it goes back to the streets, right? through different groups like Jeremy Setice and other groups who have participated in this street action. And nowadays there's still some remains of it online, but it's mostly back to the streets. And so other events, a band event was also here in Belgrade, the 20th anniversary of Srebrenica, which was banned, and eventually a smaller number of activists went online and went to the street through online mobilization to commemorate the 20th anniversary.
Okay. And then you also have the Not My Hero hashtag, right? That is a way of challenging how Serbs who've been convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia were basically forgiven and reintegrated, and sometimes given high positions in the Serbian government. It's a way of challenging that and maybe even proposing other heroes who would be more legitimate in their eyes.
Right. And so the Not Our Heroes is very interesting. It's two-folded. One, our is a generational belonging, right? What I call the second generation, the younger generation that has no necessarily living memories of the wars, but it's also a regional hashtag. And there actually it came about through, again, tracing the works of the Youth Initiative for Human Rights with their regional presence in their offices. They have presence in Belgrade, Zagreb, in Sarajevo, in Pristina, and in Podgorica. One of their actions was to stand in these cities in sort of recognized places with a sign and the hashtag Not Our Hero in Pristina in Albanian, and the rest of the region in, if you want, Serbo-Croatian, claiming these are not our heroes and we don't want to celebrate them as heroes, but to remember them as war criminals. And this wasn't only in Serbia. We saw a process of the beginning of the release of some of the convicted personalities who got to go home after serving some time in jail, sometimes earlier release, sometimes not, coming back to their societies and being received as and celebrated. And we saw it in Croatia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Serbia, as well as Kosovo, and some of them even became sort of very important, regained public space in their societies, becoming famous, sharing their writings, and being invited to public events. And yes, it culminated in some events here in Serbia, even during campaigns before elections, but it was pretty much a regional phenomenon that we saw war criminals coming back and becoming even celebrities, right? And so in many ways that also sort of promoted my thinking about the region as a region of memory, right? And that in a way this fight, if we think of memory activism as the claim to engage with the past for a better future or for more justice, this is one strand of memory activism. There's also memory activism on the very right-wing activists, but in that strand, I sort of understood it as needing to understand the region as region of memory and a region of memory activism. So a claim like Not Our Heroes is not just on the national level, it's a more broader engagement on the region itself.
To me, that's the hopeful part of your book, that you may have countries that are narrowing their understanding of the past in ways that don't do a whole lot to promote reconciliation, understanding, or any effort to confront the past. But you have these grassroots initiatives where people are preserving a memory of what happened. They're challenging denial, and they're working across borders. And I think that's really where you finish your book. And there are real changes that come out of it. There are events that were banned that become possible. There's collaboration, significant collaboration, and new commemorations. There's a lot of real lasting work that comes out of whether it's digital memory work or you mentioned these different regional platforms for confronting the past as a region.
Right, and for me, I would put forward how do you trace, how do we study, how do we analyze, how do we research empathy as a political practice, right? Or acknowledgement. I mean, these are if you want, the ingredients of reconciliation, but which I'm very interested in. And so I had to think about incorporating hope into the discussions on memory politics. And I also thought about it very much in that framework of commemorative solidarity, right, which I also try to take forward from a previous work by Atana Atanasio, who wrote about the women in black in Serbia. And so this establishment of the platforms for alternative commemoration as sort of allowing us and allowing activists to come together in networks of commemorative solidarity, to trace also to show camaraderie, let's say, with the other community. And in that sense, it cannot happen on the local level nor on the national level only.
Orly, I really want to thank you for sharing so much time in your evening. I really appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Orly Friedman is a professor in the Faculty of Media and Communications at Singo Dunham University in Belgrade. I've been talking with her today about her recent book, Memory Activism and Digital Memory Practices After Conflict, Unwanted Memories. Next month, we'll turn to the story of digital memories of dictatorship in Brazil. We'll hear from O Globo journalist Leda Balbino about how former President Jair Bolsonaro and his sons use social media platforms such as YouTube and Twitter to propagate conservative memories of the period of dictatorship in Brazil. My conversation with Leda will focus on her recent book, Digital Memory in Brazil, a fragmented and elastic negationist remembrance of the dictatorship. If you'd like to receive a free Realms of Memory podcast t-shirt, send a screenshot of your Apple or Spotify podcast review to realmsofmemorypodcast@gmail.com, and the best entry after each new episode will receive a free t-shirt. You can see a preview of the t-shirts on the podcast Instagram page. I'm Rick Dadarian. Thanks again for listening.